Okay, so fifth hour, we have to do one more video. This will be your last one. You guys ask a lot of questions, which is great, and then we don't get through things. So, all right, so we need to just talk about part 3, which is always about the social cleavages within the country. A lot of this will be review from what you read in the book and from what's already come up in class. So, what's really interesting about Nigeria is that in order to have a functioning democracy, which is what Nigeria is trying to do, you need a citizenry that is ready to pay attention to politics, that really has the time and resources to get involved in politics. Not that they just have to care. I think Nigerian citizens care, but it's not about that. It's about having the ability to fully participate. And one of the problems in Nigeria, a very significant problem, is that a good portion of the population is struggling to meet basic needs, and therefore participation in the democracy is maybe not realistic. In the book, on your reading guide, you'll see there's a question about Nigerian people, and they've been polled recently, and a good portion of the population now is saying that sometimes there may be a government that's better than democracy in order to keep stability. So it used to, when Nigeria first gained independence, the people, when they were polled, were saying, they wanted democracy all the way. And now people are saying stability is more important than democracy, even if the leader is authoritarian. Kind of an interesting shift. So this is a problem for Nigeria because of these conditions. 60% of the people are currently living in poverty. We have a large gap between the rich and the poor. The elites and the poor people live very, very different lives, and a lot of that has to do with resource distribution. There are significant health issues in the country, so Nigeria is facing, as part of the AIDS epidemic, about 1 in 11 AIDS carriers are Nigerian. And I think, this is also a consequence of Nigeria being the most highly populated African country. It makes sense that the AIDS issue would be very prevalent there. Overall, the literacy rate is about 68%. It's a little bit higher, quite a bit higher, I would say, for men than for women. But the educational system is one of the lasting impacts from British colonialism. People in Nigeria learn English. English is the official language of the country. So we, of course, need to start with the discussion about ethnicity. So as we've been saying, Nigeria is one of the most fragmented societies in the entire world. And there's a makeup of 250 to 400 distinct ethnic groups with different languages, different religion. The 3 major ones are the Hausa Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, is how you say that. So the Hausa Fulani is about 29% of the country. They are mostly Muslim groups, and they dominate the northern part of the country, so you can see them up here in the yellow. At one point, this was just the Hausa, and then the Fulani tribes kind of came into the area, and there was intermarriage that occurred, and so now, they're really indistinguishable from one another. So they dominate the northern half. The Yoruba is about 21%. They are divided between Muslims, Christians, and other indigenous religions. And they dominate the southwest third of the country, so down here, and that includes Lagos, which is right here. And then the Igbo make up 18%. They are mostly Christian, and they live in the southeastern part. This is a very oil-rich area of the country. So I would say for the most part, the ethnic divisions are coinciding with religion, especially for the House of Fulani. It's a dominant ethnic group, plus they practice Islam. So you have these sort of coinciding cleavages, which tend to accentuate the problems that might exist. Okay, so religion's super important. About half of the country is Muslim, 40% are Christian, and 10% are various native religions. I asked in, I think, first period about religion and kind of our perceptions of religion in Nigeria or in Africa in general. And I think this is a place of common misconception where, we kind of get this story of Africa as being much more focused on native religions when really that's a pretty minor part of the population. So, of course, in Nigeria, Islam is incredibly influential, as is Christianity, as a result of, again, colonization. That one of the things the British did was spread Catholicism and spread Christianity, Protestantism. So Christianity in general is really significant. So there's disputes among these religious groups, and that goes back to disputes that were the various groups that said that the British gave preferential treatment to Christians. Now Sharia law, is practiced in the North very sort of debatably, and that results in all kinds of differences. There's the way women are treated. That looks different in the North than in the South. There's more religious tolerance in the South than in the North. So it's a very significant cleavage. Okay, so this feeds right into the divisions between North and South. So you can see here this map is important, this distinction, states with Sharia law versus states without it. And I know this map appeared on your Nigeria lessons assignment, so you'll want to go back and refer to that. So the North is predominantly Muslim. It's a little bit poorer. They're less industrialized. They have poor healthcare systems there, and they're less educated. And the South, kind of the opposite. So they're predominantly Christian. The educational system is much stronger in the South, and they tend to be wealthier because the South is where, again, the oil reserves are located. So there's, the distribution problems exist in Nigeria, and that kind of leads to the South being better off than the North. All right. We also see, like we saw in Iran or in China, we see sort of this rural-urban divide. So there are differences in the types of political organizations that exist between rural and urban areas, between the type of interest groups that exist. The media really only operates in the cities. So, and then social class, too, is another important cleavage. So the educated elite are those with ties to the state, and they, as we'll see later, they often have their own groups that they join that you're not allowed to join unless you're part of that elite. And corruption is really rampant in Nigerian government. And so a lot of times people in the state have used the treasury to benefit themselves. We're seeing some improvements under Buhari's leadership. He's trying to cut down on corruption more and trying to arrest people in government who are corrupt. But corruption remains a very significant problem in the government. Civil society is quite open and free. There have been some issues or times when the military has been involved in suppressing violent protests, but in general, people are allowed to join interest groups. They're allowed to voice their opinions. They're allowed to air their grievances with the government. So most organizations or most of civil society is centered around that ethnic identity and religion. Like I said, the elite have their own private clubs and professional organizations that they join. Whereas, the soldiers, the veterans, they belong to military groups. So everybody's sort of got a place. Our policy group, at least in the first period, talked about the prevalence of medical organizations. Doctors have their own organizations. Talked about labor unions and how they're gaining strength. So there's lots of organizations tied to professions. NGOs are also very strong in Nigeria, so they're allowed to exist. These groups do not have to register with the government. They are allowed to freely operate. Participation in elections is right at about 54% in the recent presidential election, and you might be surprised to see that, corruption is actually pretty low in Nigerian elections, at least recently. Nigeria has an independent National Election Commission whose job is to bring legitimacy to the election process, and they have been getting stronger and doing a better job in recent years. In 2007, they were viewed as very corrupt. However, there were some changes that were made to help the 2011 election become more free and fair. So they allowed same-day registration to try to get more people to vote. They took steps to verify all the election results even on a local level. And they worked on cleaning up the voting rolls in general and who was registered. So corruption, I think that the statistic is that about 3% of votes were claimed to be fraudulent in 2011, which is certainly more than you want in a democracy, but it's definitely an improvement from what it was in the past. The election was not accompanied by there were some protests in the 2011 election that had to do with good luck Jonathan, maintaining the presidency. But there wasn't a lot of protest about the vote itself. So this commission is working pretty effectively. So the last topic that we're going to talk about is just the prevalence of protest and why people are protesting and how they're getting involved in the society. So since democracy returned from military leadership in 1999, there have been some religious and ethnic-based movements to try to pressure the government to address grievances, most notably poverty and inequality in the country. A lot of people have targeted the oil companies. They don't like, these oil companies are coming in, they're making a ton of money in the economy, and while they're living so poorly. And also there are some environmental issues with the oil companies. Oil spills are very common. In 2002, there were a number of women who occupied Chevron Texaco and their operation in Nigeria because they wanted jobs. This was an economic issue. They felt like, here you've got this big company. They wanted jobs, and they wanted jobs for their sons. So what they did was they agreed to provide jobs for the women's sons and to set up a credit plan to help them start their own businesses. There are a number of NGOs within Nigeria who are doing just that. They're helping women to become entrepreneurs, which I think is awesome. Okay, so protests grew in 2006. Again, groups were attacking the oil companies. So similarly, it's an issue of resource distribution. Probably some environmental responses there too. So there were some gangs that got involved and pretty violently attacked these oil companies. You can see what they did. They blew up pipelines, disabled pumping stations, kidnapped oil workers. So a pretty intense form of protest. And then in 2011, there were also protests, and you kind of, again, see this kind of falling along ethnic, religious divisions, or the North-South division. People were upset because Jonathan had retained the presidency. Buhari would be elected in 2015, but, they felt like, for so many years, there had been sort of this rotation of the presidents from, somebody from the South, somebody from the North. And here, this was going to mark the first time that someone from the South was going to keep the presidency, and we'd had a president from the South. And so the North was upset by that because, again, the differences between the two regions are so stark. Most recently, and I imagine that in fifth period, our group will hopefully talk about this today, but most recently, we've seen a lot of protests, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. And on Twitter, this broke out. I know, I think Michelle Obama was really involved in this campaign. So in 2014, there were multiple protests about calling on the Nigerian government to try to rescue a group of schoolgirls that had been kidnapped by Boko Haram. And so they're kidnapped from their boarding school, and some of them have been returned, but a very small number. And I know that, their families are still holding on to hope. And every once in a while, even on Twitter, you'll still see, information about this. You'll see, well, it's been so many days since these girls were abducted. And some of these families, they still have a lot of hope because there have not been published pictures of these girls that they've ended up dead. So many people think that, they're still alive somewhere. But there, a lot of protests, a lot of dissatisfaction with the government, saying that the government has not done nearly enough to rescue these girls, which is really probably a very valid point because there really was sort of very minimal effort to find them. So you can understand the protest there. If you're on Twitter, you might even, just search the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, and you'll see just the extent to, just how this took over social media, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. And I'm sure you'll be shocked, but I followed many days of NPR coverage on this, which was very helpful. And that's the end. That's the end of the notes. So have fun watching the video. We will have our test on Tuesday. And have a great weekend and go Blues.